So I'm going to talk to you tonight about a project that we've been involved with and at Sea Grant. Find my pointer so I can direct this. But before I do that, my guess is that not many people here know what Sea Grant is. So I want to start out by talking about Sea Grant, and one of the things you hear quite a bit, which rightfully so, LSU promotes the fact that it's one of the few universities that's a land grant, it's a sea grant, and a space grant university. And the land grant and the sea grant, I don't know the space grant as well, but I'm sure it's the same sort of perspective, right? Is the fact that it has an extension, very strong extension recruitment process. So if I do this, and so I'm talking about change tonight. So I thought I'd show these two photographs. We've been in existence for 50 years. We started, our first grant was 1968. You might notice some faces in this crowd. And we started in 1968, was our first grant. It actually was to the National Science Foundation. And LSU became the 13th Sea Grant College program. And we now have 34 Sea Grant programs across the nation. Every coast has a Sea Grant, including the Great Lakes. And we have a program in Puerto Rico and Guam as well. And it's, when people ask me, well, what is Sea Grant? My simple answer is, well, Sea Grant is to the coast what land grant is to agriculture. I mean, it's the same process. Our job is to get knowledge off the university campuses and put it to work in communities. I will say over 50 years, we need to work on inclusion a little bit, don't we? So we'll work on that. And we work under 4 focus areas. Several of these I'll touch on tonight. One is sustainable fisheries and aquaculture, which is sort of the topic concerning some of the challenges facing our fishing industry. But we also work with community resilience. Actually, community resilience is becoming more and more. I would say in our first 10 years in existence, most of our grants and most of our extension was healthy coastal ecosystems, trying to figure out why are we losing all the wetlands in the delta, trying to understand the causes of the problems. You can't fix it unless you know the problems. But now, since Hurricane Katrina, as you can imagine, a lot of our emphasis goes into community resilience. The sustainable fisheries has always been a big part of our program. In fact, some people call us Fish Grant instead of Sea Grant. And anyway, but I'll talk about it. And workforce development, education workforce development. I like using this graph, this diagram. Can you see? All right, I don't know where I'm supposed to be standing here. So I'll just keep moving around, or maybe sit. But the boundary organizations, and what you see is on the left-hand side, that top arrow, universities are these cool blue colors because that's where knowledge is generated. You sit in your office and lab and you do your work, and it's a very important part of the process, generating knowledge. But as you move that knowledge into where you put it to work, you start to see the colors turn red. And trust me, that's a pretty good indication of the challenges. And so what Sea Grant does is we translate knowledge, and we have a group of individuals who actually live in communities, and they live in that red zone. And so our job is to build a sort of, a boundary, if you will, between the process of generating knowledge and translating it. Very important, translating it, because you can't take what's generated and automatically expect it to go to work in communities. You have to translate it, and then you have to put it to work. And we do that by this. A lot of people don't realize we have 8 offices across the state. Some of our Sea Grant agents, Rusty is here, Julie Filegood is here, she's down in Houma, Rusty is over in New Orleans. And these are our, this is the front line. This is where the people that put that knowledge to work. Marine Extension Program, we were one of the first. We just had our 100th, help me Danny, 169th meeting. They meet every quarter, and this group has met for 169 times. Very proud of them. Rex Café, whom some of you may know, leads our Marine Extension Program. And so this is an important part of our process. And then our 9th office is down at Grand Isle. It's a hatchery we're very proud of. And this has been something that I would say Louisiana Sea Grant is most well noted in our 50-year history, and that is raising the technology of how to do off-bottom culture and farming of oysters. And this is a joint project with the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, great partnership, and one that I think the state should be very proud of, and we're at the forefront of this in the Gulf. And then you have a couple of, you saw some of the posters out front, and I think there's on the table some of our annual performance measures. And the point I want to make here is that we are very much performance oriented. And that's the beauty of working with Sea Grant, because we're so mission oriented. It is delivering these types of products. NOAA, in fact, I didn't say, but our grant, the land grant, college gets its grant from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We get our grant from NOAA, the National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration. And we are at Sea Grant, a small program. Our base funding is $68 million per year. Someone said it was the tail wing of some jet fighter, but they zeroed us out. But our legislature really likes us because what I define as the efficiency of government. You spend $1 in Washington, D.C., you see it down in the communities of Louisiana. And I think that really resonates because in these performance measures. And I was going to say, my point was going to be that within NOAA, we actually are known as one of the most performance-oriented and organizations that are funded within NOAA. And we're very proud of our group, of our accomplishments. And if you want to keep up with us, here's our website. So lacgrant.org. So why am I here tonight? So, I guess it's time to go home, right? So I want to talk about fisheries challenges. And you'll see the emblems on the bottom of this slide. This is a joint project between Sea Grant, Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, and CPRA. And we were asked by Governor Edwards in June of 2018 to go down and talk to the fishing communities to see what we can do to help them with the challenges that they face with the changes that are occurring along the coast, and also the protection and restoration projects that are being suggested. And why Sea Grant? Well, Sea Grant was asked to get involved because we're sort of a trusted entity, and I showed you that picture of a boundary organization. What's very important about boundary organizations is that you don't get involved. You're neutral. Someone called Sea Grant the Switzerland of coastal science. And trust me, that's not easy to do in Louisiana. It's quite amazing in the other states. I think the issues that we have here, we're on the front end. Other states talk about the hyperbole and a hypothesis of change. And of course, it may be 2 generations before they see it. Baby boomers will tell you in the coast that, the water in their backyard is not what they saw when they were kids. So it's not telling from one generation to the next. So we were asked to go down, and so what we did, and there's copies of this report out on the table in the back, and you're welcome to take a copy, and I'm going to go through some of the results of it. But again, our mission was to listen. Our mission was to generate the voice of the industry and present back to the industry what we heard. Now, to do this, and then we had fact sheets of different adaptation strategies that have been suggested. And when I say what did we hear, we wanted to know exactly, okay, of these ideas about how you can adapt to change, what is your preference? What's your feeling about what the priority should be? And we did that through something that we know very well how to do in Sea Grant. We had a lot of help. Jack Isaac is here with Wildlife and Fisheries, who is a professional in doing this as well. Jack's sitting over there. And we did surveys. You go out and you get off your duff, you get out of your office, and you go down into the community. That's who we are. That's what we do. And so we set up a series of meetings with our task forces. By legislation, there are a task force for oysters, finfish, shrimp, and crabs. We started with the task force We went into regional meetings, went down to these communities, met with them in the evenings. And then we had what we call dock days, or something we do every year, every spring, and in our Sea Grant program. And again, this is getting out and talking to industry members and asking them, what do you think of the preferences of this list of ideas to help you adapt? And so you can see some of the statistics. For example, we mailed out 11,000. You may not realize this, but when we did a mail out through Wildlife and Fisheries, we mailed out 11,335 surveys to commercial fishermen. And many of those commercial fishermen actually have a license both in crabs and in shrimp. And so that's just the people on the boats. That's not the dock owners. That's not the people who run the gas stations that fill up the boats. It's not the laborers that work on the boats. It's not the processors, the people who work in the processing plants. This is a group of real people, and they're really tied. And what's so important about Louisiana is that these are independent business operators. This is not a big corporation like you find maybe in Alaska or out on the West Coast. These are independent people that sit around the dinner table at night and try to figure out whether or not they're going to make a living, or send their kid to college, or pay the bills. And so it's a really dedicated group, and what an experience it was in the last 6 months. So I digress. So what I'm going to do is real quick. It's 6:15. So I'm going to go through a couple points here, and I want to start. Here's the 4 points that I'm going to cover, and take you through a story. And I have to start out with, what is the problem? What are the drivers of change? And one is, trying to, we talk a lot about the delta, and what I want to establish here is the fact that the deltaic processes in itself sort of brings and generates conflict. What do I mean by that? And partly it's because the process of building land in a delta is the river. And the river brings sediment, it brings fresh water and all the resources that build land. That's a great thing. But what you can see in this picture on the bottom left is as that fresh water delivers, that water, that sediment, that builds the deltaic processes, it delivers also what? Fresh water that changes salinity. Now, if you're a commercial fisherman that's fishing and catching a fish that has certain salinity, then this becomes a big deal. And it sets up this conflict of managing salinity and managing land. You may not have ever thought about that, but that's sort of the simplest way to put the conflict that I think we were asked to discuss. And so it's this concept of delta cycle. And it really is, wherever the river is located and connected, that delivers fresh water and sediment. The great thing is it builds land, but then it also reduces salinity. But when the river abandons a location, the land disappears, but the salt comes back in. So I'm going to talk a lot about this idea of deltas versus estuaries. And we talk so much about land, 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 delta, delta, delta. How many times, in fact, here's the word, we talked about this earlier, and Steve was sort of stumbling over it a little bit, but the word estuary. How many times do you hear the word estuary when you talk about the coastal issues? So what I want to emphasize tonight is, our responsibilities and preference, how we build around this conflict that we have of land versus estuaries. And I'm spending way too much time on this, so I'm going to go through some slides real quick, but that's the sort of premise of and so being a systems ecologist, you've got to see my system diagrams. So here's how the delta works. So, the river carries sediment, it goes out to the continental shelf, some of it lands in the river, then all of a sudden some of it actually gets controlled by this little control switch, and it floods based on the river stage, into the floodplain, and that's where it builds wetlands. Well, what controls that switch in a natural system? It's the height of the levees. When the river rises up to the height of the natural levees, historically, it would flood, or it would break through the levees. You get crevasses, So there they are. There's the crevasses. This is how the system would flood, build wetlands, and that's how the river built land. But the conflict is that flooding is bad for people who are settlements. I have a picture showing the land grants along Bayou Lafourche, for example, in the 1800s. And so all the land was divvied up. Where was it divvied up? Right along the river. So we had this conflict of flooding, people's safety, commerce. And so controlling the river was a big deal. This was the outcome of engineering the river, controlling floods. And so that ended up with cutting off the sediment supply, sets up all kinds of potential damages, not from river flooding. We took care of the river flooding. But now all of a sudden we did what after Katrina? Expose ourselves to storm surge flooding. So so we're sort of trading off this risk of the coastal landscape. So what do? Well, we build a master plan. And what does the master plan say? Build land. Build land. Why? Because that will help us reduce our risk to flooding. And that's where we've established, rightfully so, I think, as far as priorities of this dilemma. And the challenge has been is where do you put the river? And in this 1932 map, this is a 2011 satellite image, but on it I'm showing you the 1932 shoreline using a technique that we developed that actually Woody Gagliano developed back in the 1970s. It's a fantastic exercise that he developed. And it's called marsh to water ratio of 50%. So we draw a line of the shoreline based on where the water in marsh is 50% of that coastal zone. So that's 1932. Now, the next slide, I'm going to show you a picture that in green shows you where that line is in 2010. There it is. And what you'll notice if you go over to Chafalaya, that shoreline has what? Has not moved. And if you go into Barataria and Terrebonne and Breton, you see the migration. And that is the migration of the Gulf of Mexico inland. We like to talk about our wetland issue related to loss of football field every hour. But to really put this in the context, let me do another little football analogy. There are years where the Gulf of Mexico migrated 2 football fields per year inland. The Gulf of Mexico has migrated 10 miles closer to Homa. It has not migrated closer to Morgan City. You've got a complete contrast between Morgan City and who's building a levee around their city? It's Homa, it's Morgan City. They're still building levees to protect them from back flooding from the river. So flooding between those 2 parishes has a very interesting contrast. Now again, this changes estuaries because what happens in Barataria and Terrebonne? Saltwater is migrating inland with those white lines. So we've shifted fisheries and we've shifted resources as we've shifted this balance between land and freshwater and salinity. And that's the story and that we're dealing with. And in fact, if you go to Ile-de-Jean-Charles, that red dot in this little box that I have, that shoreline has migrated right over Ile-de-Jean-Charles, who they are moving today. That's one of the first climate, they call it climate refugees. I think they're actually river management refugees. and then you'll also notice Lumcon is right located in that path as well. Whoops. So what's at stake? Make a few comments. A lot of people don't realize how productive our fisheries are in Louisiana. We are second only to Alaska in commercial fisheries. But add to that, we're second only to Florida in recreational. We have 2 of the most productive fisheries in the United States. You add those together, it's over $1 trillion. And so we're the largest in the Gulf. We're still one of the largest productive fisheries. They're collapsing all over the United States. We still have one of the largest natural fisheries. And what I like to do is just think about this. You not have to read this graph. But here's some numbers for you. We generate and we harvest about 10 million to 13 million pounds of oysters. Think about that. The reason why I'm giving you those numbers is if you think you can just go out and do aquaculture and replace that, then that's a real big challenge. And I know that's something we're working on, we're working toward, but be realistic of how big our natural fishery is. 58 million pounds of shrimp. No one touches that. And so we have this really productive fishery and something that we're very proud of. And keeping that culture and keeping that fishery is part of our sustainable fisheries program. So what are we adapting to? The challenge is to convert the red. You see where we're losing wetlands and we're losing our coastline, and finding ways to reconnect that green, make that green connection, and not lose our economic, working coast concept. So one of the proposals to do that is to reconnect the river with diversions. And one of the ones that you're hearing a lot about is the one in Mid-Barataria. And the question is, again, deltas versus estuaries and freshwater, and this idea that we've adjusted these estuaries because of the engineering of the river, and how do we bring it back? And so if you don't know about an estuary, I took this little cartoon, and one of the simplest ways to define salt water is it's 35 grams of salt in a liter of water. That's 35 parts per thousand. That's the index that we use for salt water. What are estuaries? Estuaries, you add fresh water and you dilute that. And you dilute it down. And so estuaries are formed by this baseline of salt water that gets diluted with fresh water. And that is what develops the productivity that the fishery statistics that I just showed you are so important, because the nursery and salinity is one of the cues that drives that connection between the estuary and offshore. And then but you also have to have the habitats once they move in. That's also very important. So land is very important as of an estuary. It's just not salinity. Whoops. And then there are resident species like oysters who can't move. So they're sitting there and they're taking the blunt of whatever you do in the estuary. They can't migrate out and move around. And so again, it's this conflict of adding fresh water and settlement and building land relative to salinities that support our fisheries. And this is the conflict. If you're not aware of it, it's intense. And so how we work through this is something that is very important to us. And one of the ways of doing it, we think, a lot of people think, is that yes, putting fresh water in, but trying to find a compromise between, maybe compromise isn't the right word, between the flood pulse when the fresh water and sediment is delivered in the winter, but this concept of estuarine recovery during the summer, this idea that estuaries recover and you get some element by which the flood pulse actually drives land building, and the estuarine recover in the summer can support some of our fisheries. Now, how that gets worked out is way above my pay scale, and law and courts and a lot of judges and whatever, permitting and et cetera. But this is one of the ideas that does get suggested. So the point I want to make is that let's go back to our diagram that I showed on the river, and here's a control switch that I showed you earlier. Was that control switch was defined by the height of the levee. But now we control that switch. We control the floodgates. We decide when it's turned on and when it's turned off. And that's why my teaching and classes is this idea of ecosystem design. We're designing estuaries, we're designing landscapes, and not ecosystem restoration. We're not restoring anything, we're designing landscapes. And design is a very powerful word, because the reason why design is so powerful, because there's a little nuance to it. Preference. Preference. Who gets to choose? Who gets to choose when that switch is turned on? Who gets to choose when that switch is turned off? And that will define the estuary and define our land building capacity, as well as defining our fisheries. And so let me just wrap up. I have to show this one. I'm sorry. So the other change is so important is climate change. And sea level rise is a big issue. And I put this on here because notice where there's the actions that we take today relative to CO2 emissions has so much to do with sea level rise and what scenarios we're going to face in the future. And I put myself and my kids, I don't know exactly where that dot's going to be. Maybe it'll be later tonight. I don't know. But I don't know where the final dot will be. But this is the one that makes a difference to me. These are my grandchildren. And the point that you look at their lifespan and look at where they are relative to decisions that we make today. And I know these people. You know these people. And so it's amazing people forget of how powerful decisions that we make today relative to the outcomes of what this coastal zone is going to face in the future. So what do we hear? Number one, just on a couple of slides here. Number one, we heard we are struggling. It is, they are struggling. Foreign imports. 97% of the seafood eaten in the United States is foreign. 3% of that seafood is tested. Think about that. Just think about that statistic. In fact, we passed legislation relative to identifying Gulf seafood in restaurants, and it was a public health issue. That was for public health. And whoops, I'm sorry. All right, they told me to get off stage. All right, so what else did we hear? I clicked something wrong, but it's good. Yeah, exactly. They don't like adaptation. That's very important. We heard that over and over again. Why don't you adapt? We heard a lot about the fact that we've been adapting all of our career. All right, you got it. We need more information. River diversions are a major concern, and sharing the coast with multiple users isn't easy. In addition to that, I would say one of the major things we heard is allow us access to where the fish are going to be when they move. We know there's change. We know the fishing is going to be in different locations. How do we adapt to be in that productive fishing zone? For oysters, it's lifting moratoriums. A lot of times it's helping with boats and gear adapt. Actually, the shrimpers wanted a more closure. The crabbing industry wanted more closure on their industry. One thing that we heard quite a bit was marketing. They're fighting prices. They're fighting low prices at the dock is killing them, and because of the foreign imports. So how do we get a better price where you market the product and you drive this incentive for customers that are willing to pay more for Gulf seafood because it tastes better, it's safer, and so that's something that we're very much involved with. And again, this idea of changing gear relative to where the fish might be. There's a big interest in offshore fishing as well. So the crab industry has certain interest relative to the number of crab traps, putting some daily catch limits. Oysters, again, one of the things we're working on is seed production. Seed production is one of the most critical limiting factors of making sure there's productive recruitment and helping nature in that recruitment. So those small oysters will grow into big oysters. And so again, it comes back. There's also an interest in farm industry up in Washington is saying, well, why don't we insure our fishermen, our fishing industry like we do our farmers? Such as if you have a big year like 2019 flood, then can there be some help for those that industry during those really bad years? And finfish, again, what was interesting in finfish is how different the strategies are. You can't just take one issue, one solution, and stretch it across the entire coast because it's wet. There's a lot of river, a lot of fresh water in Atchafalaya, very different baritaria and terrebone. So here's my final little system diagram. I don't think I've done this very well, but so here's the fishing industry. You're capturing the fact that you'll notice there are no economic cost to the ecosystem producing a fish, right? The money doesn't cross over to the left-hand side. Nature does that for free, right? It produces the fish for free. And then you catch it, you sell it, you put in assets for nets and gear that you need and purchase goods and services. And then there's the diversions that will put fresh water and sediment and nutrients, and that sets up the environmental cue that sets up recruitment. So, this idea again is preference and control. Who turns the knob really sets up the recruitment aspects because of sediment and salt and fresh water, as I described. A lot of people talk about, there's harmful algal blooms that could be associated with nutrients. Just to give you an idea of how complex this is, that's something that really became of concern from the 2019 flood. Then there's also, why don't we dredge our way out of this? We can take sediment and spend cost in dredging operations. And what you'll notice in that line is, what do you notice? You put sediment in, but you don't put what? Fresh water or nutrients. You just put the sediment. So you put the sediment in, but you don't change salinity. But the problem is it costs, and there's this hard idea of scale. Can you actually really replace what you've lost over the last 30 years with dredging? These are tough issues. There's $18 billion of dredging in the master plan. A lot of people don't realize that. They don't realize how much of an investment the master plan has identified to dredging. And so it's one of the tools in the toolbox. Thank you very much. It was a lot in 30 minutes. You all deserve a beer.